on Tuesday morning, Brazil's federal government fired Wilson Cesar de Lira Santos from his position as Regional Superintendent of the National Agrarian Reform Institute, INCRA, in the state of Alagoas. While that sounds like a completely innocuous decision, certainly not worthy of a podcast introduction, it becomes more curious when you consider that Mr. Lira Santos is the cousin of Brazil's current House Speaker, Arthur Lira. In Brazil, the Speaker of the House holds one of the most important and powerful positions in politics, and governments can sink or swim based on their relationship with the head of the lower house of Congress. And it looks like the Lula government and Arthur Lira are on a collision course. And that's what we're going to be exploring this week. I'm Ewan Marshall, Deputy Editor of the Brazilian Report, and this is Explaining Brazil. If you like Explaining Brazil, you should subscribe to the Brazilian Report, the journalistic engine behind this podcast. We're an independent organisation funded by our subscribers, and you can help us stay independent and continue to produce award-winning journalism. Our work has been recognised for its quality, and we've won several international awards, and the Brazilian Report was recently nominated for Best News Website in Latin America by the World Association of News Publishers, WANIFRA. To continue this work, we need your support. If you're already a subscriber, you can go the extra mile and join our Buy Me a Coffee fan page, and in return, you'll get exclusive perks like special newsletters and behind-the-scenes content, as well as a shout-out here on our podcast. And today, I'd like to thank our Buy Me a Coffee members: Jaciara de Oliveira, Carson Allen, Gabriel Luca, Andrei Novoseltsev, Pan Ludwig, Leslie Seal, Mark Hillary, Louise Renz, Erwan Menais, Aaron Berger, Kars Vriesvik, Alistair Townsend, Miller Renasido, Peter Abramson, David Dixon, Josetto Z. Stankovic, Emerging Market Muser, Anna Lund, Peter Suffren, Anderson da Silva, and someone who wishes to remain anonymous. And our Buy Me a Coffee members come from all over the world, so please, if we're butchering the pronunciation of your name, please send us an email. If you too believe in the importance of independent journalism, and if you want to hear your name on our podcast, go to buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report and subscribe to one of our membership levels. Click on buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report to find out more. The main flashpoint of this crisis between House Speaker Arthur Lira and the Lula government has been the Speaker's falling out with Alexandre Padilha, the Institutional Relations Minister who's also the administration's liaison with Congress. And to go into detail on these recent disagreements and their wider impact, we've invited political science PhD Beatriz Hey back onto the show. She's an incoming research fellow at the University of Lisbon, a postdoctoral fellow with the Brazilian Policy Agendas Project at the University of São Paulo, and a fellow at Pop Vox Foundation. And she's contributed many times to the Brazilian Report, so we're delighted to have her back on Explaining Brazil. And what you'll hear next is our interview with Beatriz, conducted by our Brasilia correspondent, Cede Silva. Over to you, Cede.
Professor, thanks for your time and your attention.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's been a long time since I have spoken to you guys. I'm very happy to be on the podcast.
So let's begin by telling readers exactly how we know that this is a public crisis. So recently, House Speaker Arthur Lira called Minister Alexandre Padilha incompetent and called him a personal opponent or a person he cannot get along with. And later, President Lula publicly replied that Minister Alexandre Padilha is going to stay in office regardless. So what is going on here?
I think it is important to start our conversation by giving context in which the remarks by House Speaker Arthur Lira happened last week. He said that Minister Alexandre Padilha was his personal enemy. I don't know if enemy is the best translation. Right after he suffered a big defeat on the floor in the House. And that defeat related to the decision to maintain or not federal deputy Chiquinho Brazão in jail for being one of the he's being accused of being one of the masterminds behind the murder of local legislator Marielle Franco. And why do I say it's a big defeat? Because Lira acted to help Chiquinho Brazão in two main ways. The first was postponing the vote, right? The Supreme Court arrested Chiquinho Brazão more than 15 days ago, and Lira postponed the vote until last week, which made the environment or made the conversation shift in this time, allowing the opposition to mobilize and introduce other frames that made the vote very tight. So, for instance, last week we had a lot of Bolsonaro supporters in the House saying that this was not a vote about Marielle Franco, but this was a vote about the prerogatives of the legislative branch. So Lira basically gave time for the opposition to reframe the debate over the imprisonment of Chiquinho Brazão. The second way was Lira helped. He has a favorite candidate for his succession, who is the deputy from União Brasil called Elmar Nascimento. And we know from the press that although Lira himself was not acting to direct votes last week, he helped Elmar Nascimento he helped him do that on the floor, right? The vote in the end maintained Chiquinho Brazão in jail, but legislators were very dissatisfied with Lira by the end of the day, and were accusing him of playing a double game while he was signaling to the Supreme Court that he acted to maintain Brazão in jail. He was also acting on the floor to release him through Elmar Nascimento. So legislators felt that they were exposed by Lira, especially because this is a major international, it's a major case that has international repercussions, right? And for the legislators, electoral consequences.
So you were saying that House Speaker Arthur Lira wanted to satisfy some of the House members by freeing Mr. Brazão from jail, and at the same time, he didn't want to pick a very public fight with the Supreme Court. So he was playing both sides.
Yes, he was playing both sides, which at the end of the day was a very bad decision from him when you think about the succession of the House Speaker next week, right? Because so I think that day last week was very significant. Like, it was very important in terms of the succession that we're going to see. We're already seeing that since the carnival, right? I think all the candidates for House speakership already mobilized, and we could talk about that if you want. But what happened last week was right after this episode, which you described, Arthur Lira going to the press and saying bad things about Minister Alexandre Padilha. In my understanding, he was very angry and dissatisfied with his own strategy. At the same time, there was a party happening in Brasilia from another candidate for House speakership, who is Marcos Pereira from Republicanos, from the party Republicanos. And all players in Brasilia were there. Interestingly, Marcos Pereira himself was not on the vote. He was absent. But he threw a major party that lasted until like 5, 6 a.m., and all major players were there. So that to me is a strength demonstration that probably hurt Lira when you think about the House speakership election next year.
Why is it is so important for Lira to have his anointed successor be elected speaker next year?
That is a very good question, and I'm in the process of putting together a project for my second book, and that's one of the questions that I want to answer. But you saw the same behavior with Rodrigo Maia, right? He tried to put his successor, Baleia Rossi, and failed. And at this point, if you ask me if Lira is succeeding, I'm going to say no. I don't think that Elmar Nascimento is in a good position right now, especially after last week. I think part of it is they want to have a legacy, and I think that was very much the case with Maia, but also the case with Maia, and also the case with Arthur Lira. There is a political project, right? Maia had his intention was very clear in terms of putting somebody who would serve as an opposition to then President Bolsonaro. And now I think Lira wants to have somebody who would serve as an opposition President Lula.
Okay, let me get back on something that I feel has been very naturalized by Brazilian press, that there's a large part of the Bolsonaro friendly right-wing opposition to the Lula administration who has sided with Congressman Chiquinho Brazão. He has been arrested for obstruction of justice. He has been accused of a very serious case of double homicide, of being the mastermind along his brother Domingos Brazão. And in my understanding, it appears to me that a lot of people in the Brazilian press have basically naturalized alliance between the Brazilian right and organized crime, notably organized crime in Rio de Janeiro. So what is going on here?
That's another very good question. I don't know if you probably watched all the speeches that legislators were giving, both on the Committee of the Constitution and Justice, where so the vote happened in two arenas, right? First in the Committee of Constitution and Justice, CCJ, and then on the floor. And so you had legislators, the deputies giving speeches on both in both arenas. And some of the speeches were frightening. There were some deputies that were flat out saying, like, one in particular, I think from Republicanos, if I'm not mistaken, said, well, yeah, it is a tragedy that Marielle Franco was murdered, but people get murdered every day. So,
Yeah, that was Congressman Lafayette Andrade from my home state of Minas Gerais. He's from the Republican Party in Brazil, and that's exactly what he said. It was a tragic crime, but tragic crimes happen every day in Brazil.
So there is a movement from these Congress people to just banalize what happened with Marielle Franco. And I think when I look at that movement and I look at what Arthur Lira did last week, I think it's disgraceful that he and Eumar Nascimento were trying to articulate to release this guy from jail. Your description is exactly what I believe was the line of argument. And that was the line of argument of the rapporteur and the committee as well, that he was arrested, not particular at the decision to arrest him was not focused on the murder itself, but on obstruction of justice, right? That was the issue. So I don't know. I think we do have a part of it's. I want to believe it's a very small part of the House that sided with Chiquinho Brazão, and it's probably, I can't say for a fact, but has at the very least some ties to Chiquinho Brazão to the point that they were defending him in their speeches.
And also a major part of the Liberal Party, the PL, which is the largest opposition party and is the party to which former President Jair Bolsonaro belongs. So something else, Professor, that I want to get to discuss is there's always this drawer in the cabinet of the House Speaker, this drawer which contains the motions to impeach the president, nowadays to impeach President Lula. Does this discussion or this debate, this open struggle between House Speaker Arthur Lira and the minister in charge of relations with Congress affect in any way the possibility that President Lula can be impeached?
So it is interesting that you asked me that, because I just read a news article in the newspaper O Globo that to me was an information that was given by Arthur Lira to the reporter, saying that it's not going to affect impeachment requests, that Lira is going to continue to set the agenda with the tax reform implementation and yada, yada, yada. But to me, that's how bothered Lira is, that he's trying to set the media agenda to put the impeachment on the conversation, right? It was not until today. So I think he's trying to at this point, we should expect him to try to project force, right, through the media. And that's exactly what he did with this impeachment conversation. I do want to say, though, that we know that the relationship between Arthur Lira and Alexandre Padilha is very bad since, at the very least, the end of last year. From what we know from the press is that they haven't talked since the end of last year. And that's very different from the behavior we see with the Senate Speaker, Rodrigo Pacheco, who is always in contact with Padilha and the Finance Minister, Fernando Haddad, and also the government leader in the Senate, Jacques Wagner. So we have two very different behaviors from the House Speakership and the Senate Speakership. with the House speakership having no contact from we know whatsoever with the part of the government that is supposed to manage relations with Congress, right? So I think, although I gave you this context in relation to Chiquinho Brazão and how that comment specifically came out in that context, I do think that the relationship between Lira and Padilha is bad. And that, I think that's probably why Lula said that he's going to keep Padilha for a longer period of time. I think it bothered him as well.
So, if I understand correctly, this thing about impeachment is kind of a veiled threat.
Yes.
So when the press is talking about this struggle does not affect impeachment, it's like when someone asks you, do not think about an elephant.
Yes.
If I ask you to not think about an elephant, you're going to think about an elephant. So when he says, do not think about impeachment, so it's to keep impeachment in mind as a possible
Yes.
card for him to play.
Yeah, he's projecting force, which is what we should expect him to do. He suffered a major defeat, which affects, again, the succession for House speakership. I think the party that Marcos Pereira threw last week was a major demonstration of force. And you have to look at what's happening in the backstage, right? The election for House Speaker is happening since January, if not before. I think it's happening since last year. You saw a lot of these candidates in campaign during the carnival. So every move now has to be understood in terms of the election next year.
Okay, so let's talk about Marcos Pereira. Marcos Pereira is a member of Brazil's Republican Party that we have mentioned before in this conversation. And in Brazil, the Republican Party is a little different from the U.S. Republican version. Republican Party in Brazil is basically the party of the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God. It is heavily linked to a specific evangelical denomination and to Bishop Edir Macedo. This group also owns a large network television station, which is TV Record. So can you talk more about the role of the Republican Party and evangelicals in Brazil and why they are so strong?
They are strong because Brazil is becoming more and more an evangelical country. And I think Congress is a reflex of that. It's not surprising to me that you have a cross-partisan organization that is formed of evangelical legislators. Brazil is going through this change, right? So, and Congress is the reflex of society. So you're going to see that change in Congress as well. Although the Republicanos is the one party that we know that identifies with evangelicals, you have other evangelicals in other parties, right? For instance, one of the strongest leaders, evangelical leaders, Pastor Silas Malafaia, has his legislator, Sóstenes Cavalcante, in another party, right? So you have legislators, evangelical legislators spread all over in several parties, of course, less so in the left. And I think Marcos Pereira is trying to take that agenda to House speakership. Although I want to say he's doing he's taking a very interesting path. He's open to Bolsonaro supporters, of course, as you said, it is an evangelical party known by its evangelical membership. But he's also being open to all sorts of people, as the party that he threw last week showed, right? I don't think he's closing the door to the government necessarily, right? So I think we have to wait and see how he's going to behave, because Lira supports Elmar Nascimento. And I think given that is out there, Marcos Pereira and the government candidate, who is Antonio Brito from the PSD, they are going to behave accordingly to what happens in relation to Lira.
That's interesting, but the relationship between Speaker Lira and the Lula administration, it's not all struggles, right? So last week, the House under Speaker Arthur Lira, they approved what we call in Brazil a jabuti, which is a tortoise. This is an earmark or an amendment to a legislation that is completely unrelated to the legislation, and this was approved with a massive vote, including with votes from the opposition. So what happened was the House was discussing a bill to reinstate an insurance policy for victims of traffic accidents. And in the middle of this bill, which is about insurance for victims of traffic accidents, a deputy whip for the government inserted a change to the fiscal framework that will allow the government to spend a few billion reais more this year. And this amendment, which gives a larger check to Lula, was actually approved by a large vote, including many people in the opposition and many people that the following day would vote unsuccessfully to free Chiquinho Brazão from jail. So what is going on, and how does the Lula administration sometimes can agree with the opposition or vice versa, and for what interests?
That's politics, right? I'm going to give you another example. Just this morning, I was reading in the newspaper that both the government and the opposition, and by that I mean the PL, the Bolsonaro's party, both of them are citing to pass a constitutional amendment that would instate a minimal percent of investment for defense to police the military, the armed forces. That's the state of politics right now. I think that there is a complicated factor in Brazil that parties in general are not programmatic. And I have talked about this for this podcast many times. I think we have a lot of parties that are driven by clientelistic interests, such as cabinet positions or earmarks or access to power, and not necessarily policy programs. So that blurs the line in terms of what sort of compromises you can make. That said, I honestly was very disappointed, and I have been very disappointed with the government's path towards how the government is dealing with the military and the armed forces more generally after everything that we know happened on January 8th, right? So I think, to me, the Workers' Party, from political science, we know that it's the one party that we have in Brazil that it leans more towards the programmatic side of politics. And to see that the government, who is now being occupied by the Workers' Party, siding with the opposition to, for instance, please the military, it's very disappointing. I think in the example that you gave me, to me, I think it's small fish compared to the one that I just gave you, just because of the impact and a long-term impact in Brazilian politics, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. We have been covering the work of the Lula administration to whitewash the role of the military in the January 8 riots and the attempt to have a coup in Brazil in late 2022, early 2023. And it's really been really an impressive effort in the negative sense. And we have Defense Minister José Múcio Monteiro acting as what many experts have called basically a dispatcher for the interests of the top brass in the military. For everything related to Brazil and Brazilian politics, keep following the Brazilian Report. This has been Professor Beatriz Rey.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us.
And that was our Brasilia correspondent, Cede Silva, and his interview with political science PhD, Beatriz Rey. If you like Explaining Brazil, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts. Or better yet, subscribe to the Brazilian Report, the journalistic engine behind this podcast. Our work has been recognised for its quality, and we've won several international awards. Recently, the Brazilian Report was named the best news website in the Americas for a small or local newsroom in the 2024 Digital Media Americas Awards. And to continue this work, we need your support, so go to Brazilian.report/subscribe. I'm Ewan Marshall, thanks for listening, and Explaining Brazil will be back next week.